Hello. I'm not very fond of microphones. All right. So my name is Raph Goodblatt, and I'm an architect here in Portland. And Mike, what's your last name? Munzing. He's a structural engineer. So we're going to talk to you kind of in tandem. It's up to you. Okay. So we're going to talk to you about what the building means and the process for basically the environment that you're going to do your work in. Some of you might have a dispensary, some of you might be doing edibles, and others of you might be doing grows. Now, I know for myself, I've been very fortunate in the last 6 months. I've worked on 6 different grows and 4 different grows and 4 different buildings, and I'm getting ready for my 5th one. And then I've worked on 8 different dispensaries on different levels. So I feel like I'm finally understanding what it needs to go into a grow. And some of the biggest things I always start with is whatever setting you're in, whatever building you're in, if you're going to do a grow, for example, and you want to move into a building, the first thing you have to do and the first thing I would ask you is for the permit history of the building. If I did not know the legal permit, like the legal occupancy, or you did not want me to go and research it, then I cannot work on the building. It's the very first step. Once I know the legality of the building that I'm working with, then I can send you in the direction of what you want to do. And the reason why that's a problem is depending on the building, depending on what you do, you could scale up into large financial things that would include a structural engineer much more. So like the first 4 I did, only one of them had to actually do a change of occupancy. And it was even a silly one, you know. So it was kind of, I tried to talk them out of it, but they really wanted to go through it, and so I just took them through it. The other thing to remember, so the first thing you do with a building is know your history, and so that means you either call somebody like me, or you go down to the city of Portland or the local municipality you're in, and you find out the legal history. Okay? The next thing you have to realize is when you're going in for a permit, you're not going in for a permit with one entity. A planner will look at it, a life safety person will look at it, a fire marshal will look at it. They'll look at it for what you're doing with your trash. They're also starting to figure out, I just had a long conversation with environmental services about what you're going to do with the water that comes out of your building. So every aspect, just like with the mechanical, so when you're looking at doing a grow, you're looking at 8 different departments, not just one. And one of the things that I just got from one of the growers that I was working with, I asked him, what's the biggest thing you learned from this? Because he just kind of went off, and I did the drawings, and he goes, the biggest thing I came up with is to get bids, get signed contracts with contractors, and get bids for the work. So, for example, when I do my work, I always do it the same way. I always call me up, oh, yeah, great to meet you. Let me come out and look at your building. So I come out and I look at your spot, and I don't charge for that. If you want to go on, then I say, okay, let's check the history, and then I get started on the project. And I write you a proposal. Like I don't do it, okay, I'm going to write you a proposal. I'm going to tell you what I'm going to do for how much. Now, usually for me is I tell people, look, I can't figure it all out at once, but I set a little price. I say, okay, I need about $2,000 to get started and really figure out what you have here. And then after that, I start being able to give you a lump sum. Now, that's just my process, but I've been learning, and I do that with all of my projects, whether it's a grow or not. But I feel fortunate that I've been able to work on so many right now and work with these people who are just starting, because now I know the minimum walls to build, how to make the minimum attachments, what are some of the other headaches. Now, I had the chance to talk to environmental services about what to do with the water. One of the grows that I just did, he goes, no, we haven't settled the decision yet, so I'm not going to make them put in this tank. Okay? So this guy got away with it, right? But the next one I'm about to go in for is a larger factory, and I've already told them we'll probably have to put this tank in. I just don't even know yet. Because I know for the city of Portland, they're just wrapping their head around what to do. So the biggest things you ever take away is never, anybody who wants you to lease a building, unless you know the history, you can get yourself into larger economic problems. So that's the first thing I always try to tell people. So now that I've talked a lot, I'm going to put it on Mike a little bit for the structural engineering. And I can come back. I'd like to answer questions when people have. I have a couple of particular questions. I'd really like to focus on, if somebody has a building in mind, you tell me about it, and I'll try to give you a response.
Yeah, so I just wanted to, I think that's kind of the talking about figuring out what the existing occupancy of the building is, things like that are really the first steps. In terms of, like, we've done a couple dispensaries. We have a commercial grow. With my partner over here, 7 Points. So we've gone through all of these steps. Did most of the stuff permitted, some of the stuff a little bit under the radar, which hopefully doesn't come back later, but for the most part. But the major things that can become issues with, especially for dispensaries where you have access, public access, is change of occupancy, where you might have, say, a building that's currently zoned as, or the occupancy rating is for, yeah.
So when Mike talked about a building, there's two designations that every building in the city of Portland gets. No matter what it is, it gets a zoning designation and it gets an occupancy designation, and they're different, and you have to understand both. So what Mike was saying is the building, you have to check the zoning for the neighborhood, and then the occupancy is about the building itself. And you have to know both, because both of them can either cut you out of the situation or make more headaches. So if you do a change of occupancy, that's when Mike and I are even more needed.
Yeah, and the reason I say for dispensaries is because we've done a couple dispensaries where there was a change of occupancy, going from, say, like a warehouse or storage or some sort of less occupancy that has less exposure to the public to something that's like more retail. That can trigger. There's certain triggers, change of occupancy, certain amount of dollar value added to a renovation or anything like that. But basically, that can kick you into doing seismic upgrades to the building and basically retrofitting the whole building, bringing it up to current codes. And that kind of thing can add, depending on the situation, can really add significant costs. In many cases, it can make it not feasible. So that's kind of one of the bigger things. And then in terms of structural engineering for grows and things like that, I mean, generally speaking, you want to have big open floor plans. There's significant, especially if you're not on a ground level, you're going to be adding quite a bit of weight potentially with your equipment and just the plants and tanks, especially water tanks, and water storage. All of these things can, require structural upgrades to the building, and that's usually, I mean, I would say the biggest thing to take away from my own experience in planning and actually building out a commercial grow myself is the best thing you can do is plan everything. Get an architect involved, or talk to somebody like Neil and really get the figure out what kind of space you have to work with and what kind of space you want to build the space into, and really helps to have an architect involved who's familiar with egress, because like you were saying, one of the biggest headaches or hurdles is getting through fire life safety down at the city of Portland. Especially, they're pretty they're one of the stricter jurisdictions around, and they're gonna make sure that you have proper fire exits or escapes, distances from one point in the room to an exit, wall assemblies, fire ratings, having the proper assemblies that for a 1 hour fire rated wall assembly if you need it. And there's just having everything on paper, plans, blueprints, showing everything. In terms of structural engineering, I mean, a lot of times it makes more sense to put equipment, cooling equipment and stuff like that on the roof. So sometimes, especially in a lot of the old warehouses in Portland where a lot of these grows are actually going in, there's, some, depending on the size of the equipment, it could require strengthening of the, roof joists and whatnot. So just having an idea of everything that goes into it, from spatial planning to all of the systems, cooling, electrical. That's another big thing, is electrical too. A lot of warehouses and existing, especially old buildings in Portland, don't have the electrical capacity to support, a commercial grow. And that can be a huge amount of expense, as well as there's quite a bit of waiting around if you wanted to do electrical upgrade to a building. To bring in, there's a lot of different variables, but to bring in electrical service into, like a 800 amp three-phase service into a commercial building that doesn't quite have it, you're talking probably $15,000, potentially more, and you're probably going to be waiting around for like 2 to 6 months before PGE and city sign off on it and get the service there. So that's another big planning.
As it works further back than just the building, we might actually have to change the transformer that feeds the building because it doesn't have enough power. So all the components are the HVAC, the electrical.
The HVAC and the electrical are all very expensive components that you have to get your shopping list together right away. To simplify, what I do is I put your shopping list on paper. Then you take that shopping list and pass it out to all the contractors, and you get numbers on it. That's the simple, fast description. If you're willing to write down your shopping list and get 3 bids, then you've done your homework in terms of taking care of your money. I mean, that's the simplest way. Some of the guys I know that we didn't get 3 bids, but like even a simple set of walls for 2 rooms were $20,000 to build with wood, labor, sheetrock, insulation, and then I don't think that was the mechanical units. And these were each like 800 square feet. But they had a drawing. I showed them all the materials. They had a couple questions. They asked me to change one thing out. We changed it out. We saved them a little bit of money, along the way. Okay. So does anybody have questions or a particular one they want to mention for a moment? We'll try to answer a question.
Well, just how much in your consideration is the workflow of packaging product? How much is that involved?
What do you mean?
In the planning process.
The cheapest one, if you're asking me my fees for them, is that what you're trying to get to?
I'm talking about like a lean flow. How does the product move through from clone and growing?
Oh, okay. So I know what people have shown me, but that's almost more of a question for a person who's a grower. Because mostly what I'm doing is I'm helping them with the grow room, and then everybody always has a veg room, and then they have a dry room.
I'm sorry. So your question was, what's the flow process, in terms of like how to actually go about growing?
Setting up the whole space. Just how material actually moves through, because it's got to be cleaning, it's got to be as far as cleaning.
The one thing that surprised me the most as people build out commercial grows, and it's certainly the ones that are truly, going to pass every level of inspection, is we're only seeing at most 40% of the square footage be flowering space. And I got to admit, 5 years ago when we dreamed up gardens, everyone was putting as much of their space dedicated to flowering as possible. But when it comes down to, there may eventually be some sort of quarantine space or safe needed to hold product. We're finding most gardens are going to have to be ADA approved, which from what you would maybe know more.
What part it is, like the building itself, when you get in, you have to be ADA accessible. Whether the grow area is, that's a good question because it's agricultural.
And maybe it's because they're not changing the building use occupancy, but we have seen grows have to be built for ADA approval.
Right,
which
all of that is a factor in it. But like for example,
when you ask about ADA, if you build new walls in your space and you spend $50,000, the city and the state is going to make you spend more money to make sure the building is ADA compliant. So it never stops just at that $50,000. There's things they'll add on.
And a lot of times it doesn't matter if you're going to have people in a wheelchair.
I'm sorry, but
A lot of times it won't even matter if everybody has a wheelchair. They want an ADA no matter what.
it's a rule. You build, you pay.
Yeah.
That's the simple way to look at it. If you spend $10,000 on your building, you can spend a little more on ADA.
And also with the ADA thing too, like if you were putting in a bathroom, as long as part of that build can be ADA compliant, like making sure the doors have, lever handles, the toilets are a certain height, things like that can be factored into that. But when you go down to the city, if you have everything in line, they're going to ask you what percentage of your budget is going towards ADA, and that's actually, that's why I think that's why it's important to have like an architect or somebody who's familiar with the permit submittal process to be able to actually, kind of give you a heads up on a lot of this. Because a lot of times you may plan something and then come to find, they'll send you away with a whole another list of things that you need to do, and usually that entails, additional budget and stuff like that. So.
And I don't always get my permit the first time also. Like, I'll lay down my drawing, I'll forget a little something, I'll go away, pick it up, and turn it back in. So it's not like it's a perfect world there either.
Yeah, and same with structural engineering. Like, we'll submit permits, and then, usually I'm hearing from the structural plans examiners. They'll look at it, they'll ask questions, they'll ask for clarification. Sometimes they'll, point out something that, we missed, or something that isn't quite up to current code or whatever, so we have to go back and make changes, and sometimes it's like a negotiation process as well.
Are there more questions? Do you have a question? Or somebody else? Yeah.
A lot of this seems to be for people who are going to be moving into existing structures. Do you have anything for people who are going to be building from the ground up?
From the ground up, it's pretty straightforward. You build in a new building. It just depends on how many square feet. Always look at your exits and kind of opposite ends of the building. And straight up is straight up. Again, it's a zoning issue. You have to check your zoning to see if it's allowed. And then from there, you'll only allow a certain amount of square footage for the building. And so you still have to plan it out. And depending on the size, you'll be required to have either an architect or an engineer. The code says a licensed professional.
Yeah, and for any new building, you're going to need a structural engineer, generally speaking. If you were doing like a prefabricated, like steel, if you went with a prefabricated building, like the typical Butler Truss, steel buildings, normally they'll have an engineer that basically runs through calculations. A lot of times you'll have to hire a local engineer or somebody with a local stamp, such as myself, or somebody to design the foundation and sort of check it for make sure they designed it with the proper loading and all that kind of stuff, lateral and gravity loads. But yeah, if you're building new, it's a lot easier because you can do whatever you want to do.
But there's still things like a new building on parking. You know what I mean? There's all kinds of other expenses that go with a new building that you can minimize in an existing building.
Yeah.
Does anybody understand when does anybody have a question about a change of occupancy and understand when it would come into play with their building? Because we've mentioned it a bunch here, and I don't know if we've actually described how it works.
Yeah, like change of an occupancy is based on what is actually what you're doing in the building. So if it's and there's like storage, warehouse, retail, restaurants, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But it's really it's essentially just a tabulated value, or which corresponds to the amount of people per square foot in a building related to what its intended use is.
So it starts with things like A's and E's, which is assembly in schools. Okay, they're the most dangerous, so there's more rules. And then you go down to warehouses and factories, which have less rules. So depending on where your building falls and where you're moving up or down in occupancy. So then occupancy has value, and it tells everybody what the safety features will be.
Yeah, like for instance, like with large exposures to public, like public assembly areas, you need panic hardware on the door, so and doors swinging outward, and things like that. That when a plans reviewer at the city is looking at your permit application, they're going to ask you for your door and window schedule and what kind of hardware you're using and what direction the doors are swinging, what the fire rating is for the doors, and all that kind of stuff.
Is the occupancy something that gets determined by formula, or is there wiggle room to make arguments that it's not a change the way someone's saying it is a change?
I was going to say it's basically what your intended use is. So if you're like we just did a dispensary. It was a seismic upgrade. It was actually like an old service station, like this prefabricated metal service station, out in northeast Portland. And, so the change of occupancy was going up in public exposure. So it went from, like, I don't know what a service station is, but.
See, the first thing you tell me service station, I'm doing the mechanical room for the digital hoisting, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And there's also the space for the office.
Right. So this, well.
I'm not even trying to get that out of the change office.
Yeah. Well. Yeah. So the architect
here.
here.
Small buildings and those aren't a huge problem.
Yeah, and this one wasn't that big a deal, but just as an example, it went from, a lower, like a type M occupancy or something like that, up to a type B occupancy.
No, those aren't. I'm not gonna.
Whatever.
School you here, but M and B's are kind of on the same line. So.
Yeah, well, it was a step up in any event, and so it triggered a whole seismic upgrade. And as well as some of the, they were increasing load and stuff like that. So instead of basically, we had to just retrofit the whole building for seismic and wind or mainly seismic loads, because the building was built, in the 1960s, and the codes have changed significantly since then. So we had to basically, retrofit the whole building with brace frames and all kinds of stuff. Sorry, go ahead.
So, if we were starting the process of going out to look at existing buildings to build a grow with on-site processing, what sort of occupancies?
The city's calling that an F occupancy. Yeah, I'm sorry.
The city calls that a F occupancy, or the building code calls it an F occupancy, which is industrial. So, and most of the buildings you look at will either have an S or an F. That's what I've seen mostly.
What's an S?
Storage.
And have you noticed a difference down at permitting between medical grows and larger recreational grows?
It doesn't matter. If it's a grow, it's a factory, and they only look at the factory part. If it's a dispensary, it's always an M, which is retail, and then it heads in that direction. Those are the two so far. I will say the one problem I'm having with is I actually do not agree that it's an F1 occupancy, that it's an industrial building. I actually think it should be a agricultural building or a storage building because it behaves more like that. The city has tagged the F1 on it only because they don't know what else to do with it. And now that I've done a few, I would love to start a discussion of what it should really be, because it's agriculture. You're not actually making something, you're growing something. And if that distinction works to your advantage, you should get to use it. So.
When I went down there, I convinced them that my building, which had medical offices in it, was fine. And they all agreed twice that a medical office designation was okay.
That doesn't what?
A medical office designation with light manufacturing was adequate for medicine growth.
Well, what's happening is a medical office building is a B occupancy. Okay.
A grow is an F. On their chart, B is higher than F. So if I take a B and use it as an F, that's different than taking an F and using it as a B. So they were letting you go down in hazard, but going up in hazard creates all the extra problems for the structural engineer.
What I wanted to point out is I have a commercial nursery and tissue-culture laboratory on agricultural land. We have a service station in one corner at one time. And the EPA stuff, we've got to check out. But think about any of that.
Right. The EPA is another one with all the gasoline tanks and everything that's in your area. So the EPA is another entity in terms of oil tanks around like a gasoline station or something like that. Sorry. Oh, is that what it is? Okay.
What about zoning restrictions?
So what you zoning is its own headache, just to tell you the truth, okay? So what you're looking for in a zone is basically something like an industrial zone, or like you don't want a residential zone. But even within that, if you found a warehouse that was that was in a residential zone that had been there and was legal, you could actually still use that as the same use. So there's conditional uses with stuff like that, but mostly you're staying out of residential neighborhoods.
And also regarding that, I mean, the way that the laws are shaking out right now, there is kind of a push to get at least the commercial level grows and operations out of residential areas, because that's really where, the politicians are hearing the most, complaints about neighbors complaining about their neighbors, and smell and the concern of crime and all that kind of stuff that are the negative things that are associated with it. So if you are looking for a property, I would say definitely try to stay outside of residential areas, stay in the more industrialized areas, and obviously you need to stay away from the 1,000-foot school buffer zones and all that kind of stuff.
So let's take 2 more questions, and then I'm going to give like a 5-minute update on residential, commercial, medical, recreational, and land use, all 5 minutes, 30 seconds each. So maybe you should have front.
Maybe you'll touch on this. Now, given in the legislature several bills that are potentially going to define growing, regardless of medical or recreational, as farm use, I can't argue with that.
Right, and that's why I'd like to take that. I'd like to take a notion like that and take it back in the permitting process, because it could be an advantage in the permitting process, because agriculture has less rules in terms of enforcement.
Of those, within agricultural use, is that allowed in the Portland industrial ordinance?
Well, that's when you call me up, I look it up, I go to the zoning book. If I have to, I call a consultant that I always use for all my projects, and we double check it. And we say, yeah, you're good to go, and if I really want to check it, then I take my drawing down to the city and I check a 3rd time. So I kind of have a process where I know my stuff, I have somebody who checks my stuff, and then I go check it again.
What is the current status of farm use in Portland?
I haven't come across one. I can't give you a good answer like that.
Amy will probably be able to answer that question better.
What is an industrial park? Is there anything that you can re-permit, or anything you can't re-permit? An industrial park can be changed into retail, and I don't understand exactly why. And are there buildings that we should be looking at for retail sales?
Zoning is the first thing again, and it dictates what you can do. So even if you have an industrial park set up, chances are you can turn it into a grow, but you might not be able to turn it into a store, because those are 2 different types of occupancies. If you do that, you're in for at least like $25,000 or $30,000, 6 months, and that's just the city fees. That doesn't include everything I would have to do to get you to that point. And it might even be more. I think it's more like $28,000.
And zoning is like the neighborhood. It's usually on a block-by-block basis, whereas occupancy is the specific building. So if it's like a residential occupancy, it might be like all of Southeast Portland. There's large areas that are strictly for residential use, and then within those there's a lot of like little pockets where there's like corner stores and things like that. So those will have a mixed zoning designation potentially. And so some of those places, even though it might be full of houses currently, you may be able to do a retail store there where you have that mixed occupancy, mixed zoning use, whereas like a block away it might be strictly residential, and which would disallow you to do any sort of retail or anything like that there. And then so if you could potentially take a residential building within a zone that allows commercial use, and then apply for a change of occupancy, and then that's much simpler, because it's just specific to that building. So.
And the last thing I'll say is just remember, please check the occupancy of your building. Amy, you can come up here while I talk. Check the occupancy of the building and understand your zoning, your occupancy, and from there you're on the right foot. Don't assume you can do what you want in the building that you find. You've got to check it out before you do anything.
Sorry.
That's okay.